Medieval castles were not only powerful fortifications, but also true miniature cities with their unique infrastructure. To enter the castle, one had to pass through a village where artisans, guards, and ordinary people serving the castle lived. The number of inhabitants could range from dozens to several hundred. Medieval castles were more akin to fortified camps. At the centre stood a tall tower, serving both as a defensive structure and a residence. Other buildings, such as storerooms, stables, and living quarters, could be destroyed during a siege, forcing all inhabitants to take refuge in the central tower, known as the keep or donjon. Inside the castle, spaces were divided by carpets and screens to create an illusion of privacy and to block drafts. Corridors were narrow and maze-like, aiding defenders in case of an attack. Castle staircases were typically steep and difficult to navigate, deliberately designed to hinder enemy intrusions. However, this also posed challenges for the castle's residents, especially when intoxicated. Castles were cold and dark. Small windows let in little light, and central halls were heated by open fires. Smoke escaped through a hole in the ceiling, leaving the walls covered in soot. During winter, castle inhabitants suffered from the cold, despite heavy furs and carpets. Hygiene conditions were far from ideal. Toilets were simple holes leading to cesspits or directly outside. In summer, the stench became unbearable. Interestingly, toilets were sometimes used to store clothing, as it was believed that the odour repelled insects. Water was drawn from wells or nearby rivers and carried throughout the castle in buckets by servants. The lack of basic sanitation often led to outbreaks of disease. People suffered from plague, typhus, and other infections, while the medicine of the time was almost powerless to help. Despite these hardships, life in a castle was vibrant and fascinating. Nightly tournaments attracted large crowds. These events were not only displays of strength and skill, but also dangerous occasions where participants often sustained serious injuries. After the tournaments, feasts were held, featuring meat, fish, vegetables, and exotic dishes. These banquets were accompanied by copious amounts of wine, which was considered an essential part of the festivities. Wine not only entertained the guests, but also served as a way to purify water, which was often unsafe to drink. Feudal lords were fond of hunting, with falconry being particularly popular. Women also participated in this activity, impressing onlookers with their skill in handling falcons and riding special side-saddle mounts. In addition to hunting, feudal lords found enjoyment in gambling. Card games, dice, and other games of chance were popular pastimes in castles. These activities were often accompanied by high stakes, and losses sometimes led to serious conflicts among participants. It was not uncommon for prostitutes to be present at the gaming tables, becoming part of the entertainment. Their presence added an air of frivolity, but also became a source of intrigue and disputes. Evenings in castles could end unpredictably. Once the guests and hosts were sufficiently inebriated, it became the perfect opportunity for thieves. These cunning criminals waited for vigilance to wane and began stealing valuables. Their loot often included jewellery, money, and sometimes even the personal belongings of the lords. Theft in castles was a true art, requiring not only skill in stealing, but also the ability to escape unnoticed. Infidelity was also far from rare. Life in a castle was often confined to a small social circle, which heightened interest among the nobility in one another. Feudal lords frequently engaged in secret affairs with servants, maids, or even guests. Historical records document numerous scandals involving unfaithfulness, which sometimes escalated into open conflicts between families. Chronicles mention instances where lovers were publicly humiliated or even executed to restore the house's honour. Interestingly, some castles were equipped with specially designed hidden passages leading to the chambers of lovers. These secret corridors allowed relationships to be maintained in secrecy from spouses or servants. However, if such an affair was discovered, the consequences could be catastrophic for both the lovers and their accomplices. Among the unusual roles in a castle were poison testers, leech catchers, and even whipping boys, who were punished in place of heirs when the latter misbehaved. This created a unique social structure characteristic of castles during that time. Castle inhabitants often suffered from parasites such as lice and fleas. Clothing was rarely washed, and baths were taken only once every few months. Food was sometimes stored in unsanitary conditions, frequently leading to food poisoning. During a siege, castle residents had to survive on dwindling food supplies and, in extreme cases, even the carcasses of animals. During an attack on a castle, one method of infiltration involved climbing through sewage drains. This risky tactic required incredible agility and endurance from the attackers, as the sewer passages were narrow, dark and filled with foul sludge. Often, the attackers relied on the element of surprise and prayed that the toilet wasn't in use at the time. Despite the disgusting conditions, this approach was sometimes successful, particularly if the defenders didn't anticipate such a maneuver. Medieval unsanitary practices also meant that trash and waste were often thrown directly out of castle windows into the courtyard or streets below. This not only created an unbearable stench, but also contributed to the spread of infections. To combat hunger during sieges, castles sometimes resorted to brutal measures. Domestic animals, including dogs and cats, were killed for food, and rats were also consumed. In extreme cases, instances of cannibalism were recorded. Castle inhabitants also suffered from the widespread prevalence of venereal diseases. These illnesses thrived in an environment of frequent infidelity and extramarital affairs. Treatment was limited to primitive methods, such as the use of mercury ointments, which often worsened the condition of the patients. These diseases not only caused immense suffering, but also frequently led to death, leaving a grim legacy in the history of medieval castles. Castles were often incredibly noisy. The sounds of blacksmiths at work, merchants shouting, loud conversations in the halls, and barking dogs created a constant cacophony. At night, peace was disturbed by rats and mice scurrying freely through the living quarters. Another shocking aspect was the inequality in food distribution. While noble lords enjoyed exquisite dishes, servants were often left with scraps or heavily spoiled food, leading to illness or even death. The contrast between social classes was stark. Fires were a frequent hazard in castles due to the use of open flames. The lack of reliable firefighting systems often led to catastrophic outcomes. In a single night, an entire castle could be reduced to ruins, destroying everything inside. Many castle women suffered from illnesses related to difficult childbirths and poor hygiene. The tools used by midwives were often a source of infections, leading to fatal complications. Servants working in castles were often subjected to cruel treatment. Punishments could be public and ranged from flogging to more elaborate methods such as hanging by their limbs. This creates a grim contrast to the idealized image of medieval nobility. Water brought into the castle was often contaminated due to its proximity to sewage sources. This led to outbreaks of dysentery and other intestinal infections, which could kill dozens of people within days. Castle moats frequently served not only a defensive purpose, but also functioned as sewage disposal. All waste from the inhabitants was dumped into the moat, turning it into a breeding ground for diseases. These foul-smelling moats repelled enemies not only with their stench, but also with the threat of infection. Some castle walls concealed deadly traps. Forgotten corridors sometimes contained pits into which victims were thrown. Those who fell into these pits remained there forever, their cries lost in the darkness. Alchemical laboratories were a common feature in castles. These spaces were used not only to create medicines but also poisons, which were often employed to eliminate political enemies. Experiments frequently ended in accidents. Some castles had dedicated torture chambers where prisoners were held and interrogated. Torture devices were often put on display to intimidate enemies and keep subjects in fear. In some cases, live people were entombed within castle walls. This was considered a form of sacrifice meant to protect the structure from collapse. During restoration efforts, archaeologists often discover the remains of these victims. Life in medieval castles is full of unexpected facts, mysteries, and fascinating stories. If you have any additions, feel free to share them in the comments. Join our channel and don't forget to like this video. Your support helps us create more exciting content. Stay with us to learn even more amazing things.